Good morning.
Sorry, knock anything over. No, I'll just use this. Wow, it's loud over there. That is not me. There was a day when I looked like that. It is not today. Sorry, that's not. Yeah, that is so not me. Not right now. I don't go upside down much anymore. For a couple children. So, are we all ready to get started? Yay! I'm so excited you all are here. Thank you all for being here. As I mentioned earlier, I'm Ginger Gummelt. I'm with Lamar University in Beaumont, Texas. Yay, water. We are the ones who were affected terribly by the floods. We're still standing. All is good. We're very happy about it. So, super excited to be here where it's nice and dry and all is good. I'm going to talk to you today about the emotional needs of women in sports. I have my social work background always goes back to those who are the most vulnerable and oppressed, and I always go back to the needs and the advocacy of women, and women in athletics I believe is such an important part. So I'm going to go over this quick study. I'm going to tie it back into the social work values and then move it on. We've got 4 presentations in this little group right here. So make sure I'm going in the right direction. There we go. Okay, so in this study, I was looking at the emotional needs of women in sports, and so I was looking at 3 specific areas. First, self-efficacy, then self-conscious emotions, and then self-compassion. It was a relatively small study, about 130 individuals. It was all college-level individuals. So we had a control group of about 65 and about 65 athletes, and we compared the responses to the surveys. So the self-efficacy, which was looking at the individual's perception and judgment of themselves. How do I look at myself? How do I see myself? How do I see myself compared to others of my group? So the questions that went out on this part of the survey, the physical self-efficacy scale, were focused either on the athletes or just in general, but depending on which side was how the questions were set out. It was, the scale was set out by Macaulay and Gill many years ago, and really just looks at how do I feel about myself? Am I capable? Gave them a lot of scenarios. How do you respond with that? So that was the first, about 10 questions of this survey. Then it went into the self-conscious emotions, and self-conscious emotions are more complex emotions than our basic emotions. And basically what they say with the self-conscious emotions is that there's more awareness, more self-awareness involved, and they're not developed at birth. They're a little further along. So we don't develop our self-conscious emotions until later toddler years. Self-conscious emotions include shame, guilt, pride, and embarrassment. Now there's a few others that different researchers kind of hang out there, but those are the 4 main ones. Females versus males. Shame, guilt, pride, and embarrassment. Females tend to weigh heavier in 3 of them. I'm going to let you take a guess on your own. And males tend to weigh heavier on 1. So pride tends to be more of a male experienced emotion, whereas the shame, the guilt, and the embarrassment tend to be more dominated with our females. And that's where it started to get really interesting to me with our female athletes. So we used the test of self-conscious affect, the TOSCA, set out by Tangney and Deering. And those, again, were situational questions. If I were in this situation, my self-talk would be, and it gave them 3 or 4 options. So I walked away from an embarrassing situation and I felt, oh, that was the best I could do, oh, I should have done something different, and they scored themselves that way. And then the last part of the survey was self-compassion. And self-compassion works on a continuum, and so it measures, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this continuum in a few minutes. But it measures basically our self-kindness and how gently we treat ourselves. So it's kind of helping us to combat any of these issues we may have with particularly the self-conscious emotions. So some of the things we found here, and before I move into this, one of the reasons this survey I feel was really important is because these feelings of unworthiness, these feelings of rejection are going to really impact our self-concept, our self-efficacy, how we perceive ourselves. And for women, it is more intense. And then with athletes, where we focus so much on who we are, how we perform, what we're putting out there seeking that perfection, that level of perfection, it's more intense. One of the things I looked at with this as I started to get some of the responses back, I wanted to see if there was a difference between the independent sports versus the team sports. Because particularly for female athletes, we see a little bit of difference here. We have our independent sports, our gymnastics, our track and field, our golf, our tennis, any of those ones that it's an independent performance that then may go to team success. And then we have our team sports where we're really relying on our teammates, our softball, our basketball, our soccer. So a different focus on those. Now the interesting thing, I thought we might see something different, particularly with self-concept. I thought when it came to self-compassion, we'd see something different. Nothing. Everybody's the same. The female athletes pretty much scored about the same on all of these. One of the things I think that's really interesting is the limited amount of research we see on female athletes. It is so much less than what we see on males, and yet female athletes at the collegiate level make up 45% of the athletes. We have more sports that females participate in because there's a wider diversity of sports than there are for males. And 45%, and yet the research out there just is somewhat more minimal. All right, so I'm going to that's just kind of a quick overview of that. So what did we find out? First of all, we found out that female athletes do experience more, particularly of the guilt, that guilt talk. Now, they were higher in most of the self-conscious emotions, but not so much that it was significant. It was the guilt that was significant compared to the control group. Very interesting, related to how do I think about myself, how do I think about how my performance is, and then feeling badly about it. I should have done differently. I should have done, to me, the guilt is always those should-haves. I should have, I would have, I could have, particularly the shoulds. And I'm always telling my students, we got to quit shoulding on ourselves. Step away from that, because that's what leads into our guilt. The second piece was they scored lower in perceived self-efficacy, which I found a bit surprising, particularly when it came to perceived physical ability. They saw their physical ability lower than what our control group saw. So they're not athletes, and they felt competent, whereas our athletes were constantly saying, I'm not quite good enough. I'm not quite good enough. And that's what links all of this together. These emotions and these feelings of it is, am I good enough? Am I okay? And am I going to be okay as I move on? So lastly, on the self-compassion, and I love the self-compassion piece because it really goes on this scale. And we looked at 3 areas: kindness to self-judgment. So where do they fit on this kind of continuum? Am I more on the kind side toward me, or do I veer more toward the self-judgment? The common humanity versus isolation. Do I know that when things are tough, I need to go and take care, hook up with my people, or do I go and I isolate and I tend to pull toward myself? And then mindfulness and over-identification. Do I over-identify with the problem? Do I identify that it was me that was the problem? Or do I step into an action that's going to help me solve it and move away from it? And what we found out of this, not so much that the athletes were so much higher on the kindness, the common humanity, and the mindfulness, but they moved far away from these really negative ones. And they were significantly further away from the negative ones. So they were less likely to engage in the self-judgment, the isolation, and the over-identification, which was interesting to me because it indicates that these athletes have some coping skills, that they've learned these coping skills that we hope will translate into life of how do I care for myself. And I know I care for myself by not overjudging, by not isolating. And so they stepped away from that. Now, lastly, in my last few minutes, I want to tie this, I'll talk a little more on self-compassion, sorry. We had lower in all of our opposing, I did mention that. So let's talk about our social work core values. This is one of my favorite things to do with classes because I believe as social workers, everything ties back to our core values. And when we're talking athletes, I don't know if any of you all have experienced this, but we have. We sometimes see groups of social workers who say athletes aren't really the vulnerable population. And I beg to differ. I believe we are. And I think if we're constantly tying this population back to our core values, we're able to show that, yes, this is a population that deserves the attention and the work. So what are our core values? I'm going to open it up to you all. Can you come up with, There's an argument if there's 5 or 6. I'll take the 5 because there's one that kind of combines together. Give me some of the core values. Can we get them?
Self-determination.
Self-determination's close to it. It's kind of built into one. Yes, that's one my students always say, self-determination. But it's kind of built into another one. We got any of them? Advocacy is also built. So service is one, and that's kind of in our advocacy, right? Our self-determination is kind of built into our dignity and worth of the person.
Importance of human relationships.
Importance of human relationships, one of my favorites. Competence and integrity, those are the 2 that kind of go together, so I'll let y'all have them as just one. Did we cover all of them? Oh, we're missing one big one. Social justice. Yes, we are missing social justice. So service, social justice, dignity and worth of the person, importance of human relationships, and competence and integrity. So each one of these, how do they tie back to this and our athletes? And how does it tie in with these female athletes? Our service, are we out there providing service to all those who are vulnerable? And if we look at female athletes as the more vulnerable population, which in many ways they are, we have to make sure they're having access to services as well. Our social justice, our advocacy. Are we out there being the voice for those who do not have a voice when they need it? Our dignity and worth of the person, which says that all persons deserve our services, deserve our work. Are our athletes within that?
Sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so are our coaches, and so are our governing bodies. And so we work at all these different levels so that we're addressing these needs of these individuals. I'm wrapping up. Human relationships. I think that goes right into our self-compassion. If we're teaching the importance of the human relationship and we're teaching our athletes how to value this, then it translates over, because we know that most female athletes are going to do it in youth sports, in high school sports, in college sports, and then it's over. Less than 1% ever go on, if females go on to be professional athletes. Less than 1%. I don't know anybody in here who might have reached that. It's very rare. So we've got to help them understand these. And then competence and integrity. Am I doing what I'm saying? Am I a person as a social worker? Am I going to be the one who steps up? Am I going to follow through with this commitment that I have to reach out? There's my beep. I'm running out of time. Am I going to continue to advocate? We turned the sound off, but we did not. That's okay. All right. So, and with that in time, thank you very much. I appreciate you. I'll pass it on.
All right. Well, we'll have a quick Q&A for Ginger. If you have any questions with regard to the presentation or any thoughts that you'd like to share, feel free. Anyone?
Anyone? Okay. All right, great start, right?
All right.
There were no questions?
No questions. I'm that
I'm not
thorough.
ready yet, so.
Okay. We'll take
I know better. I teach at the higher education level. That just means we just want to move on. Yeah.
All right.
Right. It is. It's a lot to throw in there.
Sure. And, as you know, Ginger will be around for the entire conference, so you might have questions.
That's the fun of being the first presenter.
At that time, but by all means, please let us
Yes,
know.
I will be around.
All right.
It's 70 degrees in here, y'all.
It is 70 degrees. When it popped up, I was like,
I have 7 minutes.
No. You've got 12 minutes. But we'll extract it.
Well, it's okay, I'll just go till,
Yeah. There you go. All right, you ready? Floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody.
good morning.
I am Diana Rowan. I'm from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte School of Social Work. And my topic today is on adverse effects of chronic concussion, post-concussion syndrome in the former NFL players' wives. Okay, so this is a little bit different. We're not talking about the athletes themselves, but talking about their wives. Now, kind of reminiscent of what Ginger was saying, I often get comments from, folks around my college that, want to know what my research agenda is focusing on. And I'm talking, I'm all social justice, this and that. And when I bring up NFL wives, you can only imagine the kind of, scoffing, like, you know, what kind of vulnerable population is this? And I dare say, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but perhaps some of you had the same thought in your own mind about, you know, what is the threats to well-being for them. And so at the end of my 12 minutes, we'll see if any of that has changed.
The down button.
Down.
The down button, yes. I don't know.
Okay, all right. And you'll see my capitalization for the word hits. The whole concussion issue that's going on in the NFL hits the home. I'm talking about where the player, the former player, lives. Okay, I can do it this way. This, that's me, and this is my husband and my ex-husband in his previous life. And I stress ex because that's part of the story of what happens with serious post-concussive syndrome. And that is at the 50th anniversary of the Miami Dolphins last year. In case you're curious, concussions by player position, my ex-husband played linebacker. I always thought that that would be a position that would make you most prone to head injuries, but it's actually not. It's the corners and the receivers that are most susceptible. I saw, incidentally, off the track this morning on Good Morning America, if anybody was watching that, they had a thing about youth concussions, and they did a study on what positions is most common. And in that study, it was quarterbacks had the most head injuries. In case you're not too familiar with concussions, it's not actually on the place of the impact that the damage happens. It's on the other side where the shock, where the impact of the brain going in the other direction happens that causes damages to the nerves and the blood vessels. It's so small there, I can't read it, so I have to do it this way. Professional football has historically had a quick return to play policy. In the old days, they used to call it getting your bell rung, and it would be considered unmanly to not return to the playing field pretty quickly. Now, especially since 2013 when the protocols changed, we don't see that so often, and we see players, you know, pulled to the side by the athletic trainers, and it ranges from you know, arguing to try to get back in the game to being carted off the field. I'm remembering Luke Kuechly crying last year for his second concussion. Now he's on his third concussion. Here's some of the symptoms in the player of the post-concussive symptoms. And I want you to be thinking about how this would be if it were in your home, okay? So get out of the mindset of the player and think about the children, the families, the spouses and partners. Dullness of thought, just kind of not being able to grasp things quickly. Mood swings all over the place, not like bipolar mood swings, but I mean like within the course of a conversation, having dramatic mood swings. Serious problems with memory and attention, and not just the kind that come with turning 50 or something like that. Serious debilitating headaches to the point that makes you, for some of these guys, want to go sit in the dark in the closet. Dizziness, lightheadedness, depression, not as in feeling sad, but to the point of multiple suicide attempts repeatedly. And imagine how damaging that is to relationships and to parenting roles. Isolating behaviors, and then, of course, obviously, relationship problems that come from that. I know that the word that the counselor, the marriage counselor would use with my husband and myself was, I'm forgetting it. it was emotional recklessness, and I thought that was a good description, just kind of out of control. All right, so we hear about post-concussive syndrome with the players all the time. I thought this was really interesting, this cartoon that I saw. It's time to take seriously the danger of concussions by the NFL. And then he says, for the players' wives. I'm assuming what he's saying here is like, for the players' wives' sake, we need to take this seriously. And I thought, my gosh, how astute is this for a cartoon? I mean, this is super serious, and this is affecting a really kind of hidden population, and I don't even know that this cartoonist was, picking up on how spot on he or she was. This was one of the first times the impact on the wives hit the news. This was in 2012. Jim McMahon's wife talked about the problems in their household because of his head injuries in Sports Illustrated. Not too much came of that article. So what happens off the field with the families? It affects the children's spouses, different partners, even their exes that are kind of left in the wake, and sometimes there's multiple relationships, serial wake of kind of damage. But we have a lot of research and a lot of money being spent on the impacts on the athlete and on how to prevent those impacts, like with the helmet studies and the Harvard studies, Virginia Tech, all of that. Nobody's really looking at the wives. So we have a small study going, and it's qualitative, which is what you do with a topic that very little is known about. So we started with just 10 NFL wives. And I'm going to continue the study because with qualitative research, you continue to go until you reach saturation. So you start to hear some of the same things over and over again. And that didn't happen. I thought 10, we might get that, didn't happen, so we're going to keep enrolling some wives. These are some of the main themes that were coming out. There's a lot of stigma in general in society around mental health issues, but imagine the stigma that comes upon someone who has, for their life been seen as very hyper-masculine. You hit the NFL, there's an expectation of success and, all this, testosterone, virility and such. And then if you also add in the high percentage of African American players in the league, we know about the relationship to mental health and stigma in that particular community. Players, the partners expressing guilt over blaming the former player for the change in their quality of life. In qualitative research, it's totally allowable for the researcher to be, have a participant role in that. And so I can vouch for myself that I have often felt, kind of, guilty. I don't want to, blame him for, this or that behavior because it's not his fault. But the behavior is still happening, regardless of what is the origin of it. Other of the wives that we interviewed expressed a lot of skepticism about what was due to the concussions. This was super interesting. I hadn't anticipated this. Super, super interesting. What was because of the concussions, and what was because of the NFL personality, the player personality that grows out of all of this kind of praise and adulation that comes all the way from high school, right? Typically an NFL player certainly led their high school team in receptions or tackles or whatever it was they were doing. On through college, where they're a scholarship athlete and pretty much own the dang campus, right? Nowadays all geared up, Nike, Adidas, all of that. And so that can kind of create personality traits that are very entitled. And several of the women talked about this, about I don't know if his, a lot of bad words, that type of bad behavior is due to the concussions or if he's just basically an asshole, is what they said. That'll probably be in one part of my presentation that gets on the video.
It will.
All right. Difficulty sustaining relationships because of the isolation, aggressiveness, and then you can't talk to anybody about it because you have to keep up appearances because there might be a signing, some donation and you're going to have a table and sign autographs somewhere. And so you cannot be out at the grocery store with your girlfriends crying about what happened the night before because it's secret. The only other people you can talk about it to, what they're saying is each other. And they do have a private blog connected with the NFL Players' Wives Association, kind of off track. It's not totally connected, but it grew out of that. And I was thinking of you, Emmett, you would love to analyze the content of the blog. I don't know how to do that, but that's your deal. And then the word paralysis used about the suicidal ideation, which is kind of constant, and we hear that from in the research about having had a history of serious concussions. And then irresponsible spending also seems to be a thread, which is why I want to do a few more interviews and see if I'm still hearing a lot about this irresponsibility around spending. And then when you connect that with the NFL settlement, the concussion settlement that you've probably been hearing about, NFL is about to pay out. They've paid off two people. That was a Freudian slip there. They've paid out settlements to two families so far, one for ALS and one for CTE, which would be death. But you can see that the amount is really not that much. You talk about somebody who played back in the day before they knew about the impacts. They're going to be 50, 55. Cognitive decline is what most will be diagnosed with. So that's say $400,000 or $500,000. After you pay off your attorney, which the smallest amount I've heard would be 25%. After you pay that off, it's very small amount of settlement. Considering all of the medical and psychiatric expenses, repeated hospitalizations. So what does this mean for social work? Well, there's about 20,000 former NFL players. The class action suit is closed now at 14,500 players, so that's how many have registered. There was an initial suit by just 4,000, so they've really put the word out and got everybody in the case. But for each of those 14,000 applicants, there's a family. There's kids, there's wives, there's exes, there's girlfriends who were abused for however long and then got the hell out of there, that kind of thing. So this represents a whole lot of people. Ginger just reminded us about social work values, inherent right and dignity of every person, service, and social justice. So if I'll challenge you with that question again, is this a population that is marginalized, is vulnerable, and requires intervention? So I'd like to take our data when we're finished and think about what would be maybe a little online little intervention or something that we could put out instead of just a blog. How about some sort of, I don't know what it would be yet, a module or something. I haven't gotten that far. Like a good qualitative researcher, I'm not jumping to the conclusions yet. Something culturally specific to the football culture. And then to make this even more crazy, I want to show you this. I've just told you what happened in my life, right? You can only imagine what that walk has been like, okay, about what football has done to my family. Here's the crazy thing. There's a mysterious there's a mysterious ingredient in this, a